I want to start briefly with a little bit of history, so how the coca leaf got into the 61 Convention, what were the reasons, the arguments that were used at the time, then what did it mean in terms of the treaty obligations, but also what exemptions are already embedded in the treaty that also can be used more. Then the previous attempts to challenge the global ban on coca leaf, and then enter into more detail of the WHO review process that is currently in motion. What are the possible outcomes? What are the challenges? And also then end with what are the challenges, opportunities in a global campaign to do as much as possible to... Okay. To do as much as we can to ensure a positive outcome of this review process, which is not at all guaranteed, as I will explain. So, yesterday Wade already mentioned the Commission of Inquiry, where it basically started. He referred to the quote that you see here at the bottom from Fonda, who was the head of the ECOSOC Commission of Inquiry. And indeed, when he arrived in Lima, before the work started in the region, he already said, no, coca chewing was not just a harmful and pernicious habit, but a cause of racial generation of many population groups, and a decadence visibly demonstrated by numerous indigenous and even mestizo inhabitants. And we hope to achieve the absolute and certain abolition of such a pernicious habit. But I also want to draw attention to the role of Pablo Osvaldo Wolff, who has played a crucial role. It's painful even to read out these words, but I'll explain why. I will do it. The Indio who does not chew coca leaves is clear-sighted, intelligent, light-hearted, willing to work, vigorous, and resistant to diseases. The coquero, on the contrary, is abolic, apathic, lazy, insensitive to his surroundings. His mind is befogged. His emotional reactions are rare and violent. He is morally and intellectually anesthetized, socially subdued, almost a slave. Moral degeneration accompanies the physical. Lying is one of the outstanding characteristics, probably due to a lack of moral equilibrium. Criminality is high, and barbaric forms of homicide can only be explained by a certain moral insensibility. I mean, reading these words today is just painful. Why is this important? Pablo Osvaldo Wolff was the person, he was a WHO official. He was the one who did all the preparatory work for the ECOSOC Commission. He compiled the bibliography of data that had to be taken into account. But even more, he was the head of the WHO expert committee, who after the ECOSOC Commission had to recommend for international control on coca. So, I mean, reading his attitude that he already expressed before the Commission, and then having this person as the chair, the head of the WHO committee, that explains a lot. But I would also say, and that is something, I think we should also stress in the course of this WHO review process, the WHO itself has a historic responsibility for this huge error that has been made by establishing a global ban. So, in 2 committee meetings, basically the expert committee decided that coca chewing was detrimental, that it had to be seen as a form of of cocaine addiction, basically. And that was the recommendation that led to the incorporation in the 61 Convention. There was one other moment so far that the WHO committee looked again at the coca leaf in '92, a pre-review, and then they decided, concluded that it was appropriately scheduled because cocaine is readily extractable from the leaf. I'll come back to that argument. So that's why the coca leaf was put in Schedule 1, but also the Article 49, that coca leaf chewing must be abolished within 25 years from the coming into force of this convention. The single convention came into force in '64, so 25 years later, in '89, coca leaf chewing had to be abolished. There was a lot of discussion in the conference where the single convention was negotiated. There was opposition to an immediate ban. So that's why this transitional reservation was introduced to give countries 25 years the time to abolish this pernicious habit. So the consequences are that all the drugs that are scheduled in the treaty are limited exclusively to medical and scientific purposes. The previous treaties, because the 61 single convention was meant to sort of consolidate the pre-war treaties. There were 3 treaties, 4 treaties before that. But those previous treaties did not include the coca leaf, only cocaine, but also they talked about medical and other legitimate purposes. So it left more the discretion to countries to decide what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. And that was, in the 61, it was limited to medical and scientific purposes. There were a few exemptions. The first, of course, it was the Coca-Cola exemption for the use of coca as a flavoring agent, which shall not contain any alkaloids. So this gives space for basically any consumables that are decocainized. There's also the exemption of industrial use, and that is under certain conditions, but that would be applicable to recent products like the coca dyes or fertilizers. There are a few more sort of escape possibilities. Now, the penal provisions of the single convention are subject to constitutional limitations. And of course, especially Bolivia and Colombia have clear provisions in the constitution that they can appeal to and have appealed to allow the certain traditional practices to continue. But that only refers to the penal provisions, not to the general obligation to limit it to medical and scientific purposes. It became more complicated with the 1988 convention because that treaty reinforced the criminalization of everything, basically. And it deleted this constitutional exemption from the 61 Convention. It only left it intact for personal use related offenses, but anything else had to be established as a criminal offense without a constitutional exemption. So that's also the reason why all 3 Andean countries, in fact, registered reservations under the 88 Convention. The 88 Convention also strengthened the obligation to eradicate coca cultivation. And it has led to confusion because it does refer to the respect for human rights and traditional licit uses. The difficulty is, no, it seems to acknowledge traditional licit uses, but at the same time, in the same article and in one other article, the treaty makes clear that the 88 Convention does not derogate from any of the stricter provisions from the previous treaties. So that's, that makes it very confusing to talk about licit traditional uses because it does not make void the 61 obligation to abolish coca chewing, for example. So there were several attempts to look at the situation of coca leaf itself. I already mentioned this expert committee meeting in '92. They, apart from reconfirming that coca leaf was appropriately scheduled because cocaine can be easily extracted, they also said that its social role, health consequences, etc., should be studied. And then, indeed, the WHO did start the famous cocaine project, which was a huge effort with like more than 20 researchers in different countries looking both at coca leaf use patterns, but also cocaine. And when, after 3 years of research, they published a briefing kit with preliminary results. And they also said about cocaine, that occasional cocaine use does not typically lead to severe problems. But on the coca leaf it was even stronger. It appears to have no negative health effects and has positive therapeutic, sacred and social functions of indigenous Andean populations. So this caused a lot of commotion when this was released. And the US response in the World Health Assembly was immediately strong. The WHO was headed in the wrong direction. It undermined the efforts of the international community to stamp out the illegal cultivation and production of coca. And it came with a direct threat that if they would continue and if they would publish this report, the US would basically cut all funding to the WHO. So this study was never published. Thousands of pages from all the researchers were basically put in a drawer. We have published now, or a few years ago, we did publish some crucial parts of it, but still on our website, but it's still not published as a formal WHO document. So then the other attempts, in fact, before the coca reservation, in 2009, after Bolivia adopted the new constitution, first they presented an amendment proposal to delete in the treaty the Article 49 about the obligation to abolish coca leaf chewing. That amendment proposal was formally presented. There were 18 countries that objected, so it was sort of paused and never, final decision about it was never taken. It is in fact still pending a final decision about it. So if the countries that objected at the time to that amendment would withdraw their objections, it would still be automatically adopted. But that's unlikely to happen. So Bolivia didn't wait for the outcome of the amendment proposal and then withdrew from the treaty and a year later re-adhered with a reservation that basically says that in its territory, all uses of the coca in its natural form are permitted. So they no longer were willing to adhere to the provisions of the Single Convention that referred specifically to coca leaf. Again, there were a number of countries that objected. You can see the list here. 2 countries, after a lot of difficult work, withdrew their objections, Mexico and the Netherlands. For me personally, it was one of the, in this long decades of work on the issue, it was so embarrassing that my country, the Netherlands, objected to this reservation. So it took like 10 years of conversations with the Dutch government to finally withdraw the objection. But you can see there are several other, quite a lot of European countries. So we're still trying to get some of these other countries, like Ireland, Portugal, to withdraw the objections. But in this case, it did not block the reservation. At least 1/3 of the treaty parties have to register objections to make a reservation invalid. So the reservation is adopted. So in Bolivia, all uses of coca in that sense are legal. But then the next step, because that only applies to Bolivia itself, the reservation, to start thinking about an international market for coca products, but also, to repair the historical error. Bolivia then asked for a critical review, and the arguments they used was to redress this serious historical error in the control regime of plants and their derivatives. Resolving the incoherence in the current classification would put an end to the violation of legitimate rights and the criminalization of indigenous, cultural, and Andean and Amazonian medicinal practices, and would allow the international community to benefit from the coca leaf in its natural state. So this triggered the review process. It was not an easy start at all, even when this formal letter to the UN Secretary General was presented. Initially, the WHO, they immediately realized how controversial this was going to be. They had the previous experience from the US funding threat on the previous report that they tried to publish. So initially, they tried several arguments to delay the process. Initially they said, well, we can do a pre-review similar to the one that they did in '92, which is a lighter look at the situation of the classification, and is not enough to make any recommendations for change, only to recommend to move on to the critical review. To counter that argument, first of all, if a treaty party requests a review, it automatically has to go to a critical review that allows the WHO to recommend changes in the classification. But also, they referred back to, we already did a pre-review in '92. So we spent like a year to asking them to present the results of this infamous pre-review in '92. They stalled it. There were formal letters from Olivia to request the pre-review document. At some point, I pressured one of the WHO officials to go into the basement of the archives, the paper archives, the box of the 92 committee meeting. And in the end, they confessed that there was no document at all, that they only used again the 1950 ECOSOC Commission report as the basis for their decision, and did then say that it did require more study, and that led to the cocaine project, but there was no pre-review in that sense. So they also try to use arguments of lack of funding, that they couldn't just do it, that they first had to secure more funding for it. Again, attempts to delay the whole process. But in the end, they had to start. So in December, they did finally made a selection of the experts that are now working on the critical review report. And the group of experts that is now working has to look at these criteria, which are the formal guidance of the WHO review process. So I'm not going through all of them, of course, but the important ones I've mentioned, I've put in red, like the ease of convertibility, which in the end was the main point in '92 to maintain the scheduling in Schedule 1. They also did add the traditional use in the cluster of therapeutic use. And there are other elements among the 19 that would, in principle, allow the WHO to also look a bit further than the very strict medical health impacts and therapeutic usefulness. Now, for example, the current international controls and their impacts could be a heading under which they could look at indigenous rights, for example, which so far and still refuse to do. So, where are we in the process and what's happening this year? The precise date you can see on the right, but so in July there will be a questionnaire sent around to all member states, where with a whole list of questions where countries can provide data, answers about the problems or not that they have with coca leaf. They also have specifically said that additional information can be sent by all parties. I mean, that includes civil society, but also indigenous peoples. Can at that point present additional information. So then in September, the critical review report will be finalized and published. No? Still taking into account the answers to the questionnaire. And then written comments can be presented in response to the report. Then, in October, there will be the crucial meeting of the expert committee, which is usually, it's more than just the 5 people who are elaborating the report. So usually it's about between 20 and 25 experts selected by the secretariat of the expert committee to discuss the report and then to decide whether or not there is sufficient evidence, arguments to recommend a change in the classification. At that moment, there will still be a possibility for a public consultation. Now, always on the first day of the expert committee meeting, there's an information hearing where people can still present their responses to the report. Then the process is basically closed as far as the WHO is concerned. They come up with their recommendations. They are sent to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, in principle in December. It will be presented. And then the final decision is for the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is one of the ECOSOC commissions with 53 member states, and a simple majority is sufficient to adopt or reject the WHO recommendation. An additional difficulty is that the discretion of the CND is limited. They can only say yes or no. They cannot change the recommendation. And that's a tricky issue that we're still dealing with. Also because so far the WHO has maintained a limited interpretation of their mandate. So what they basically say, we can only look at the medical, the public health related aspects, the therapeutic usefulness, but only scientific evidence in that area. And they claim, and they've said so publicly, that only the CND then, when they discuss the recommendations, can look at other issues like human rights, indigenous rights. Of course, the conflict between that is, if the WHO recommends not to change it, or to change it from 1 to 2, the CND can talk as much about indigenous rights as they want, but they cannot still change the recommendation, and they cannot make another decision that would be more in line with indigenous rights. So that is an issue we're still struggling with. In that context, there is an ECOSOC appeal option. So the outcome of the vote in the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, a country can ask the ECOSOC body itself, which is the higher up in the UN hierarchy, to have another look and another vote to either confirm or to arrive at a different outcome. So that's still the ultimate possibilities. So what can they recommend? They can say basically the same as they did in '92, that after looking at all the evidence, they still think it is properly scheduled in Schedule 1, most likely then on the basis of the argument, again, of the extractability of cocaine, because it will be very difficult with today's scientific knowledge to keep it in Schedule 1 on the basis of addiction-producing properties or negative health effects. No? That would also the experts of the committee could not, in good conscience, come to that conclusion. But they can use the extractability argument, and I'll come back to that briefly later. The other possibility is to move coca leaf to Schedule 2, and the change would be, it would still remain restricted to medical and scientific purposes. It would still be classified as a narcotic drug. So the effect is quite limited, but there are lower levels of administrative control So it would give more space for scientific research, for example, but also for phytotherapeutic products, because there's no obligation for medical prescription, for example, if it is in Schedule 2. And then the other recommendation, and that's the one that we are hoping for and pushing for, is to remove coca leaf from the treaty schedules altogether, which would legitimize all uses of the coca leaf in its natural form, including opening of the international market. So what are the key challenges for the campaign? Because, as it looks now, there are still very serious obstacles in the process, both to get the WHO to have them the courage to really recommend a full descheduling. That's already a big hurdle. But also, how to get the sufficient political support to adopt a recommendation if the WHO indeed has the courage to recommend it. So the main challenges, and those are the 4 points that I want to end with. The inconsistencies of the treaty system as an argument to overcome the extractability argument to keep it in Schedule 1. The indigenous rights issue, and the other challenges are how to prepare for the possibility of a descheduling and how to prevent that it would lead to a corporate capture, and then how to rally the votes in support of descheduling. So the first one, the how to argue that the fact that cocaine can be extracted, that is not sufficient reason to keep it in Schedule 1. The strongest arguments there are to point at the inconsistencies about how plants, derivatives, precursors, extracts are treated across the treaty system. So the 61 Convention has those two main criteria for scheduling, the similarity and the convertibility criteria. So if it is similar in terms of ill health effects as other substances already in the schedule, then it has to be put in the same schedule. That will be, as I said, difficult to argue in the case of coca leaf, but the other argument is the convertibility. If it can be converted into a drug that is already on schedule, it should be placed in the same schedule. So the issue there is, what is convertibility and what is easy extraction? And I can't go now into all the details of it, but basically the convertible argument is meant to be a precursor. So something that can be changed through a chemical process into a substance that is in the schedule. The issue of extraction of an alkaloid from raw material is something that is dealt with in other articles of the treaty. So to mix up the precursor conversion and the extractability, to confuse those arguments that is basically the mistake that the WHO made in '92, and that has to be questioned. And that can be questioned also by pointing at how that has worked with other plants. Chris yesterday already gave a good comparison with kraton, which is comparable indeed to coca in several ways. There was a WHO pre-review recently, and they decided that it did not warrant international control. So that is a recent comparable review where they decided not to schedule a similar plant. But also, in the cases of cat, ephedra, also stimulant plants, only the alkaloids are scheduled. Cathinone is scheduled in the 71 convention, but cat, the plant itself, is not under international control. The same with ephedra. Now, ephedrine is a precursor for methamphetamine, which is in Schedule 2 of the 71 convention, but ephedra, the plant, is not scheduled at all. The second issue is how to make sure that this review process really respects the rights and incorporates the rights of indigenous peoples. I think it's very important that last year, both Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples took very strong positions that indigenous rights have to be taken into account. The Special Rapporteur said it's crucial that international drug policies evolve to be in compliance with the international rights of indigenous peoples. It's not that straightforward, no, with the rights of indigenous peoples. Of course, for many, coca is sacred, but also not for all. And we had several consultations with indigenous peoples and other coca-growing communities in the past months to both to explain the process of the review, but also to hear their responses. So many of them mentioned that they have suffered a lot from illegal coca invasions into their territories. Of course, that's illegal coca cultivation for cocaine production. But it has brought environmental destruction, violence into their territories, and that has led to negative attitudes from several indigenous peoples towards coca and towards this WHO process. So now that's and also those concerns coming from indigenous peoples have to be taken seriously and into account. So to prevent, in case it would be taken out of the schedule, how to prevent a corporate capture? Because we have the worrying precedent of the legal cannabis markets. We are working, STNI, very closely with traditional cannabis farmers in Morocco, South Africa, and the Caribbean. I mean, all of them have basically been excluded so far from the opening legal cannabis markets. So how to prevent that to happen? And one of the issues and urgencies is to explore what kind of protective mechanisms can be used to prevent that. And I think tomorrow we will hear a bit more about those IP-related issues and access and benefit sharing mechanisms. So this is the last slide. How likely is it that if the WHO would recommend to take it out of the schedule, or if, let's start from there. How likely would it be that half of the CND members would approve it? If the vote would happen today, I think it's very small chance that it would be approved. So it's an uphill battle, and it requires a lot of campaigning. That I also hope from this meeting that several of you can think about how to help in that process. There is the precedent of deleting cannabis from Schedule 4, which even that small change, because that was only basically recognition of medical properties. Cannabis stayed in Schedule 1 together with the coca leaf, so the change was minor, but even that small change only narrowly passed a C&D majority. And there is no precedent at all for a complete descheduling of any substance in the treaty. So in Europe especially there is concern about what descheduling would mean in terms of impact on the cocaine market. We can discuss more about that particular argument, but an important point is that at the bottom, that even if it is taken out of the schedules, coca leaf, parties will still be required to take control measures to prevent coca leaf being used as a raw material in the illicit production of cocaine. Because cocaine will stay in Schedule 1, and there are specific articles that are mentioned here that oblige countries to also prevent the cultivation of coca leaf for the production of cocaine. So if it's descheduled, there's still a requirement for a license system, for example, for government control on international trade. So it's not that descheduling coca leaf would lessen controls for cocaine. And then, the position of Europe is important because they always take a common position on scheduling decisions. Currently, they have 13 members in the C&D. So that's almost half of what is needed to get to the majority. And then it's already clear that if that recommendation would come from the WHO, there is a group of countries already preparing for an opposition, an organized opposition to prevent the adoption. In using the argument of the integrity of the treaty system has to be maintained, the fear of a Pandora's box effect, that if they allow one substance to be taken out of international control, what will be next? Psilocybin, for example. And in that sense, this historical review process, now is a litmus test whether or not this frozen regime has the capacity to evolve and to change or not. And it's going to be an uphill battle, and we need a very strong mobilization to get there. Thanks.